Evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. We know we're in for a treat when that's the energy before the event has even begun. I think Sister Madeleva would be very pleased. Again, good evening, everyone. Those of you who are joining us here in the Carroll Auditorium at St. Mary's College and those who are joining us via the live stream, we welcome you. My name is Daniel Horan, and I am Professor of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture, but before introducing our guest, I would like to take a moment to say a word about the center. The center was founded 40 years ago in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross and St. Mary's College. The Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian traditions, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. I mentioned that this is our 40th anniversary year, and with this annual lecture, our 40th, we will be closing our year-long celebration. It's a bittersweet conclusion, sweet because we have 40 years of a tremendous legacy, this lecture being one of the most important keystones of that history. But bitter as well because in January, we lost in this earthly experience of community the founding director, Dr. Keith Egan, as he entered eternal life. Keith was an avid supporter of women in theology and spirituality and of St. Mary's College. His pioneering vision makes this evening in the 40 years that preceded it possible. I know he is with us here in spirit and will continue to bless us in the work that this center advocates, the good work that the center promotes, and all of you who are touched by the opportunities and programs that bring us together. We are also really blessed to have with us Dr. Egan's spouse, Connie Egan. Thank you for your presence and for being with us. Before we proceed with our event, we also wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our native siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Katie Conboy, President of St. Mary's College, up to the podium to offer some opening remarks on behalf of the college. Dr. Conboy.
Thanks so much, Dan, and good evening to everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to welcome all of you to St. Mary's College. I don't know that I need to tell most of you that the Madeleva Lecture is one of the most prestigious events on our campus each year. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome a truly distinguished speaker, Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings. And with her most anticipated talk, we continue our celebration, as Dan just said, marking the 40th anniversary of the Center for the Study of Spirituality. I think this evening is always one of the finest examples of intellectual vitality that characterizes the St. Mary's campus. Since the days of our legendary third president, Sister Madeleva Wolf, CSC, St. Mary's has been known for bringing speakers, artists, theatrical productions, and other programming of the highest quality to our community. The Madeleva Lecture continues this tradition, annually honoring a prominent woman scholar and generally highlighting the vibrant voices of women in theology. Tonight, as we celebrate a historical milestone for the center, we raise up a vibrant voice from the discipline of history. So thank you for your presence tonight. I'm sure you will appreciate and enjoy Dr. Cummings's lecture. I also hope you'll leave inspired by the creative and intellectual energy of our campus. And now I welcome Dr. Horan back to the podium to introduce our speaker.
It's my honor to introduce this year's Madeleva lecturer. Professor Kathleen Sprows Cummings is the John A. O'Brien Collegiate Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches classes on the history of women, Catholicism, sanctity, and American religion. I anticipate we're going to get a combination of all of those tonight. In 2021, she received Notre Dame's Sheedy Excellence in Teaching Award. She's also an affiliated faculty member in Gender Studies and Italian Studies, as well as a fellow in the Co-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and the Ansari Center for Global Religious Engagement. Professor Cummings's most recent monograph, A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019. Her first book, New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era, also published by North Carolina in 2009, was also published, by the University of North Carolina Press in 2009. She's the co-editor of the volumes Catholics and the American Century, Recasting Narratives of U.S. History, and the book Catholics in the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event. From 2012 until 2023, Cummings served as the William and Anna Jean Cushwa Director of Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and the coordinator for the Conference on the History of Women Religious. She served as the president of the American Catholic Historical Association in 2017. And in fall of 2022, she served as the Teilhard de Chardin Fellow at the Hinck Center for Catholic Intellectual Tradition at Loyola University, Chicago. In August 2018, after the release of the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, Cummings published a widely read op-ed in the New York Times on the issue of clergy sexual abuse. From 2020 to 2022, she directed the Cushwa Center's project, Gender, Sex, and Power, toward a history of clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. She has received both an honorary degree and the Pedro Arrupe S.J. Award from her undergraduate alma mater, the University of Scranton. She serves as a member of Scranton's Board of Trustees and is also the chair of the Board of Directors at the National Shrine of St. Francis Cabrini in Chicago, Illinois. A regular contributor to NBC and MSNBC, Cummings has joined the Network for special coverage of the Papal Conclave in March 2013, the canonization of Popes John Paul II and John XXIII in April 2014, the papal visit to the United States in September 2015, and the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI. She's frequently quoted in media outlets on a variety of Catholic subjects, in outlets such as the New York Times, the Hollywood Reporter, Vanity Fair, and National Geographic. Quite a range. Professor Cummings is currently working on two very exciting projects. The first is a study of the sex abuse crisis in America, tentatively titled Spotlight on American Catholicism, Historical Perspectives on Clerical Sex Abuse in Boston and Beyond, and the second volume, Pope Francis and All the Saints, which is a history of the globalization and modernization of the canonization process. Tonight, we are delighted that Professor Cummings will deliver the 2025 Madeleva lecture titled Holy Women Making History. And so please now join me in a warm welcoming Professor Cummings to deliver her lecture.
Thank you, President Conboy. Thank you, Dan. And warmest congratulations to you and to everyone associated with the center on this milestone anniversary. The Observer tells us that at its inception, the center hoped to, quote, become synonymous with the words women's leadership in the church. 40 years later, it's wonderful to behold the realization of these aspirations. The number 40 has biblical resonance, certainly, but 40th anniversaries are also historically significant. They mark a hinge between living memory and historic memory. Surely there are people here tonight who remember the first Madeleva lecture well, perhaps even heard it firsthand. And yet so many have left us, including most recently Keith Egan. On my mind tonight in a very special way is Keith's successor, the late Sister Kathleen Dolphin, who arrived at the Center for Spirituality the same year I joined the Cushwa Center, 2001. Kathleen and I often crossed the road to collaborate, never to greater effect than in fall 2011, when we co-hosted the Smithsonian's traveling exhibit, Women in Spirit. Remember? Sponsored by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Women in Spirit featured artifacts from 400 communities that told the story of Catholic sisters in America between 1727 and the present. Women in Spirit was on display at the Smithsonian and museums throughout the nation, including the South Bend Center for History. Thanks to former Madeleva lecturer Kathy Hilkert, who suggested the idea and helped me persuade Notre Dame Central Administration to finance the lion's share of it. That is a story for another day, my friends. Tonight's story takes us back to 1975, which was the first time LCWR committed to sharing the history of U.S. Catholic sisters with the broader public. In their forthcoming book, Women Responding to the Spirit, Dan Horan and Jessica Koblenz identified holy women as one of 5 organic themes to emerge from the first 32 Madeleva lectures. U.S. Catholic sisters represent a significant subset of that group. Monica Helwig, the first Madeleva lecturer, mentioned Elizabeth Ann Seton and Frances Cabrini in her opening paragraphs. 2 lectures focused on a single American sister, Gail Porter Mandel on Madeleva herself, and M. Sean Copeland on Henriette DeLille. In her reflections on women's creative responsibility, Ann Patrick invoked Mother Alfred Mose, co-founder of the Mayo Clinic, and Margaret Brennan, IHM, a facilitator at Convergence 2000, where the Madeleva Manifesto was composed. At that same gathering, Sandra Schneider's then delivering her second Madeleva lecture, spoke about the influence and enduring legacy of American Catholic sisters. In her 2004 lecture, Women Shaping Theology, Marianne Hinsdale told the story of how women, many of them Catholic sisters, entered the world of academic theology. Because that story closely paralleled her own, Hinsdale made the lecture personal and told her own story as well. So I am in excellent company, but I am studying American Catholic sisters from a different angle than my predecessors. I believe I am the first Madeleva lecturer with a PhD and an academic appointment in history. Perhaps I'll be the last. I guess it depends. We'll have to see how this goes. No pressure. I am deeply honored by this invitation, and in turn, I invite you to join me in thinking like a historian about the era in which the Madeleva lecture was inaugurated. So, how do historians think? We start by seeking primary sources, especially those found in archival repositories, but also firsthand accounts like newspaper articles, memoirs, correspondence, oral histories, and legal documents. We situate these sources in their larger context, paying close attention to causality, larger patterns, and change over time. Engaging previously published work on our topics, we synthesize all of this into a compelling narrative. We try, in other words, to craft a good story. One of the many elements that delights me about the Italian language, in fact, is its lack of differentiation between history and the study of history. It uses a single word, la storia, for both. New moments generate new stories, and the launch of the Madeleva lecture occurred in the midst of a dramatic new moment for American women and for the Catholic Church. Using sources culled from the archives of LCWR, St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Harvard Schlesinger Library, bishopaccountability.org, and a dozen women's religious communities, tonight's story explores how the implementation of Vatican II converged with American social movements to reshape Catholic sisters' relationship with the past between the mid-1970s and the early 1990s. the founding era of the Madeleva lecture, if you will. Having clarified who I mean by holy women and that I'm speaking about history, I'll turn now to the word that connects them in my title, the gerund of that marvelously versatile verb, to make. This 1980 book was edited by Janet Wilson James, the first female history professor at Boston College, where she was a colleague of Mary Daly in women's studies. Practitioners of the new social history, often called history from below, James and her colleagues sought to incorporate the voices of women, traditionally a majority of all churchgoers, into narratives long dominated by the men who held most of the authority. One contributor was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, best known for her 1988 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Midwife's Tale, in which she used the journal of a Maine midwife to reinterpret the history of colonial America. That book inspired a PBS special and a mystery novel. But this essay about Puritan wives has had an even more interesting afterlife, believe it or not. Cited occasionally by scholars, virtuous women found, for the most part, sat on a library shelf until 1996, when a young woman named Jill Portugal printed a clause from its opening paragraph on a t-shirt and transformed it into a feminist catchphrase. Join in when you spot it. Cotton Mather called them the hidden ones. They never preached or sat in a deacon's bench, nor did they vote or attend Harvard. Neither, because they were virtuous women, did they question God or the magistrates. They prayed secretly, read the Bible through at least once a year, and went to hear the minister preach even when it snowed. Hoping for an eternal crown, they never asked to be remembered on earth, and they haven't been. Well-behaved women seldom make history. The slogan Ulrich inadvertently coined has since become ubiquitous. Now, notice on the upper left, that is a picture of a mug I purchased at a local women-owned business. Becky is right here. The proprietor is right here. Notice it is properly attributed. In this post-truth era, an accurate footnote is an act of resistance. Ulrich's ruminations have inspired my own, but my point of departure is a second essay in the same volume, Catholic Women, Religious and Women's History by Elizabeth Colmer, a historian and member of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ. None of Colmer's sentences have gone viral, at least not yet, but she too wrote with penetrating clarity on the theme of women's invisibility in history, enjoining scholars to recover the largely untold story of Catholic sisters in American life. Elizabeth Colmer belonged to a generation of sisters who were making history in complex and overlapping ways, as actors, as archivists, as scholars, as subjects, as seekers and tellers of the truth. They were not always well behaved, especially in the eyes of the men who held sway over them. And, being human, they were not always holy. But seeking to be true to their vows in the aftermath of Vatican II, many of them dared to tell new stories about themselves, their communities, and their church, using the past to define and defend the present and to chart an uncertain future. 40 years later, these stories help us better understand women's religious life in an era of seismic change. Of the 25 definitions Merriam-Webster lists for the verb to make in its transitive form, the one closest to Ulrich's original meaning and Colmer's larger endeavor is to be included, as in to make the team or to make the papers. Catholic sisters were arguably even more conditioned to self-effacement than Puritan wives. And yet, sisters had one decided advantage over the hidden women in other religious traditions. They had been consistently remembered in one important place, their own communities. However devoted nuns had been to cultivating personal humility, they had always maintained scrupulous records, mostly for purposes of religious formation. Communities often compiled archival documents into privately printed publications that were essentially in-house chronicles, celebrating, they lacked footnotes, they lacked context, they were invariably hagiographical in tone, celebrating the virtues of superiors, and relying on passive voice to camouflage unsavory aspects of their past. These histories are peppered with sentences like this one. During these years, troubles were visited upon the community. Mother Superior suffered greatly, but maintained steadfast faith, and in God's time, they were lifted. Now, it's technically not an untrue statement, but it just leaves out a whole lot of the details. Before Catholic sisters could be included as subjects of history, they first had to become scholars of history. Catholic women had begun to acquire doctorates in history in the 1920s. Their access to this credential was far less controversial than its equivalent in theology, but it was equally transformational. According to Sister Rosalita Kelly, an IHM from Monroe, Michigan, who earned her PhD in history from Fordham in 1927, the time had come for sisters to provide the complete details of their histories, especially in instances when, for reasons of prudence and charity, silence has prevailed on ecclesiastical differences. In her 1948 history of her own congregation, Kelly used long-hidden sources to recover the complicated truth about its founder, Mother Teresa Maxis. The daughter of a Haitian immigrant and British military officer, Maxis had been a charter member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, a congregation of women of color in Baltimore. But by the time she arrived in Michigan, at the behest of a Redemptorist priest, Maxis had been reinvented as a white woman. Fears that Maxis's true racial identity would be revealed led to her exile and subsequent erasure from historical memory. Writing to the eminent Catholic historian, Reverend John Tracy Ellis, Kelly acknowledged how painful and painstaking it was to piece this narrative together, wishing at times that she might simply go along and let the unraveled events remain unraveled. Monsignor Ellis and his predecessor, Reverend Peter Gilday, directed the dissertations of many sister historians at Catholic University of America, among them Sister Campion Kuhn, CSC. Though they produced dissertations that met disciplinary standards, sisters of this generation wrote primarily for the present and future members of their own congregations. At no time, Kelly admonished in 1950, should sister historians lose sight of their first audience. 30 years later, sisters continued to write for their own communities, of course. Their work dovetailed with Pope Paul VI's 1966 directive to all religious orders to renew their mission in the light of the gospel, their founding charism, and the modern world. Among the IHMs, scholars built upon Kelly's foundation to confront the racism and patriarchy that had fueled the historical amnesia surrounding Teresa Maxis. Within the Sisters of the Holy Cross, meanwhile, Sister Campion dug deep into the archives to recount how 19th century leaders like Mother Augusta Anderson battled with their Holy Cross priest superiors who sought to control many aspects of their religious life. At this point, honesty prevailed over prudence and charity. But sister historians who came of age during and immediately after the council were not bounded by their own communities in their choice of protagonist. Elizabeth Colmer, for example, had begun her ministry teaching fifth grade history, but a strong desire to go beyond the facts to understand the larger context, as she told me recently, led her to St. Louis University, where she earned a PhD, joined the faculty, and in 1969 founded the doctoral program in American Studies, an emerging discipline that sought to integrate marginal figures into national narratives. I could have chosen a professional headshot of Elizabeth. She's pictured here on the far right, but this picture just gives me chills. Elizabeth is pictured next to her sister and first cousin and two other women who were also adorers of the blood of Christ. This picture was taken in June 1992. The next October, the four women except Elizabeth were murdered in Liberia. They were Liberian missionaries. And this is a memorial to the 5 Liberian martyrs who in Ruma, Illinois. Colmer is an amazing woman. In her historical work, she conceptualized sisters as a single socio-historical group, as opposed to ASCs or CSCs or CSJs or OPs, and we could go on and on all night. The same was true of Sinsinawa Dominican sister Mary Evans. In her landmark study of Catholic sisters in American life, the role of the nun in 19th century America, this had originated as a PhD dissertation at the University of Minnesota. This changing historical sensibility, thinking of sisters with a lowercase s, further eroded the barriers that had historically separated women's religious communities from each other. Cross-congregational collaboration had begun before the council through initiatives such as the Sister Formation Movement, a national program for sisters' education inspired in large part by Sister Madeleva. Another decisive push came from Rome in 1956, when Pope Pius XII asked U.S. sisters to form an umbrella organization, the Conference of the Major Superiors of Women. But sisters from different congregations came together in an ever-increasing number of places after Vatican II, such as in this 1967 symposium, in which Sister Charles Borromeo, CSC, presented it as a forum for sisters who rarely interacted with each other to learn what other sisters were thinking about the transformations in religious life and society. Here is Sister Charles, pictured a decade earlier, on her way to Rome to explore how St. Mary's Graduate School of Sacred Theology could collaborate with Regina Mundi, a new pontifical institute in Rome. St. Mary's was advising that institute. I actually don't know which one, and maybe some of the Sisters of the Holy Cross in the audience can help me. I don't actually know which one is Sister Charles Borromeo because she left that one. Okay, thank you. Living history right here. In 1960, I don't know because Sister Charles Borromeo left the Sisters of Holy Cross in 1968, and her records are naturally closed to outside researchers. She, of course, was one of hundreds of sisters who left convents in the aftermath of the council. This phenomenon, combined with a precipitous drop in new vocations, led the total number of U.S. Catholic sisters to plummet from close to 180,000 in 1968 to about 115,000 in 1985. The sisters who stayed engaged in critical self-reflection within congregations, of course, but also at the national level. As part of this process, the Conference of Major Superiors of Women voted in 1971 to rename itself the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. The inclusion of the word leadership, like the removal of the word superior, reflected post-conciliar insights, but it made the Holy See's Sacred Congregation for Religious and Secular Institutes a little nervous. So much so that it only approved the name change 3 years later on the condition that the title be interpreted as the Conference of Leaders of Congregations of Women Religious in the United States of America, and not, in other words, leaders in any other arena. Catholic sisters, of course, knew the opposite was true. At its annual assembly in 1975, LCWR created a task force dedicated to raising awareness that sisters had been leading the church and American society since the colonial period, providing education, healthcare, social services to all of God's people. This task force was chaired by Sister Evangeline Thomas, a sister of St. Joseph of Concordia, Kansas, who held a PhD in history from CUA. According to Thomas, Catholic sisters' monumental contribution to American society had been hidden under a bushel for too long. At this moment in history, it was time for Catholic sisters to set their abilities and achievements upon a lampstand, where their contribution could be affirmed and appreciated by the people of God and the citizens of the United States. The project was ambitious in its scope. Thomas and her team encouraged congregations to assess their archival holdings, casting it as part of their response to Vatican II. Only in their documents, Thomas wrote, could congregations rediscover their charism and spirit and reimagine it for the modern world. This is a picture of Sister Evangeline's Rolodex that I have been through in Notre Dame's archives. It's truly a wonderful document, as is the guide that was eventually published. What the task force was proposing was an archival aggiornamento. In opening their doors to outside scholars, especially those in women's history, sisters could help tell a new story about the Catholic Church and the United States. With support from the National Historic Publication and Records Commission and the National Endowment from the Humanities, Sister Evangeline, or Vange, as I've learned she was called, and her colleagues ran workshops throughout the country, providing basic archival training to over 400 Catholic sisters. The team also surveyed 650 convent archives with the goal of producing a comprehensive inventory. A fundraising dynamo and a marketing genius, Sister Evangeline linked this project to events like the U.S. Bicentennial, which, she argued, presented an opportunity to teach all Americans about the impact of women religious on the social and religious history of this nation. So too did she seek to capitalize on the national attention surrounding the 1975 canonization of Elizabeth Ann Seton. Noting that that event coincided with the Year of the Woman, Time magazine speculated that the Vatican had timed it as, quote, a nod to women's lib. Time actually didn't know the half of it. Seton's canonization represented a decisive victory on the part of her spiritual daughters, who had worked for decades to circumvent a canon law that prohibited women from shepherding their own causes for canonization. That was not changed until 1983. Thanks to an unscrupulous but well-connected priest in charge, Seton's cause was so mired in controversy by the 1940s that the Holy See was prepared to let it languish. It only moved forward when the Daughters and Sisters of Charity, who had been divided after her death into 7 separate communities, thanks to the trouble was visited upon the community scenario, Episcopal machinations, they came to terms with their tangled history with a major assist from Annabelle Melville, the only laywoman to study history under the direction of John Tracy Ellis. Ellis, who actually paid scant attention to women in his own scholarship and was a little suspicious of history from below, recognized that Sister Evangeline's guide was indispensable, boiling it down to one simple truth: no documents, no history. The guide cataloged an astonishing number of documents that would help historians integrate Catholic sister stories into the history of U.S. education, healthcare, social work, women, immigration, urban life, and of America itself. It contained 569 entries on Catholic women's communities and, in the spirit of ecumenism, several on Lutheran deaconesses and Anglican sisters. An unofficial interreligious aspect to the project introduced a lighthearted moment late in the game. A Jewish woman working on the index called Sister Evangeline to report a terrible mistake. The list for this women's project was filled with names like John, Michael, Anthony, and Charles. She missed the significance of the fact these names were preceded by a capital S. By this point, Catholic sister historians had been drawn into the orbit of Notre Dame's Cushwa Center. Encouraging Sister Evangeline to connect with its founder, J. Dolan, Janet Wilson James commended Dolan as a scholar who was, quote, revolutionizing the study of history by writing it from the perspective of the people up rather than the hierarchy down. Living memory and historic memory collide for me here. Jay, who died 2 years ago, was my dissertation advisor. What a joy to meet him again in the archives as a young rebel historian, no less. Through Cushwa-sponsored conversations, sisters resolved in 1987 to form the History of Women Religious Network, modeled on the Berkshire Conference in Women's History, which had been meeting triennially since 1978. In 1984, Elizabeth Colmer published this survey of scholarship on women's religious life, expanding that original article, noting the rise in authorship of sisters themselves since she had published it. Sociologist Mary Augusta Neal, a sister of Notre Dame de Namur, praised Colmer's book as an account to stimulate other accounts, and, I love this, the kind of gift that only historians can give to other scholars. She wrote, let the sociologist read in terms of the definition of the situation. Let the theologian be surprised in her search for where God is, and the ethicist examine the shifting social and personal concerns. Only the historian could provide the foundation for all of them by revealing what can be found today in library and in archives. As for Colmer, she hoped her study would show that even amidst dizzying change, an institution can be adapted to a changing larger milieu, even though its essential elements remain the same. Colmer's word choice was loaded with a meaning that would not have escaped any of her contemporaries. Essential Elements was the name of a document issued by the Sacred Congregation for Religious and Secular Institutes, the same one that wouldn't approve the leadership in the title, in 1983, that declared an end to the Vatican II era of experimentation. Interpreting its language as a criticism and a threat, many American sisters responded by consciously creating counter-narratives of their own. We all make history in the sense of to make as to frame or to formulate in the mind, to conceptualize, as in to make a plan. When we narrate our own personal stories to ourselves or to others. We do this in different settings for many reasons. In the mid-1980s, many Catholic sisters did this, and I want to talk about a group of 20 U.S. sisters who came together, deeply dissatisfied with the stories being told about them, determined to exercise what Sister of Loretto Ann Patrick Ware described as the universal right to tell one's story in one's own way. Two Vatican interventions in the lives of American Catholic sisters provided the backdrop for this particular exercise. After the 1983 publication of Essential Elements, Pope John Paul II appointed a commission of bishops, headed by San Francisco's John R. Quinn, to investigate women's religious communities in the United States. The same year, the Holy See presented Detroit Sister of Mercy Agnes Mary Mansour with an ultimatum: either resign her job as head of Michigan's Department of Social Services or leave her community. Mansour had accepted the position with the permission of her community and initially Detroit's Archbishop. When in her confirmation hearing, she declared that despite her personal opposition to abortion, she would be able to countenance the part of her job that involved the disbursement of Medicaid funds to hospitals that performed abortions on poor women. In response to the outcry that followed, the Sisters of Mercy requested a formal hearing on the matter at the Holy See. But before that happened, an auxiliary bishop from Brooklyn delivered the demand directly to Mansour. In the 80 minutes she was given to make a choice, she decided to leave the Mercies. The sisters who contributed to this collection believed that these and other incidents undermined their congregational autonomy and discounted the personal insights and growth the council had brought them. Had sisters, they wondered, in all good faith and obedience, taken to heart the words of Paul VI, only to find the fruit of their efforts questioned and perhaps destroyed by Pope John Paul II. These particular stories were born out of sisters' desire to let the investigating commission know what the renewal of religious life in the post-Vatican Church has meant to us. But though they had begun telling their stories with the audience of investigative bishops in mind, they discovered in the process they were also writing for themselves. How many of us, they said, had ever looked deeply and critically at the past 20 years and assessed the changes those years had brought? In the first essay, future Madeleva lecturer Joan Chittister recalled telling her parents in 1968 that she had decided to leave her Benedictine community because religious life had changed so dramatically. Their advice to think not about what nuns do, but what nuns are, led her to distinguish between custom and charism in ways that allowed her to be even truer to her vows, she believed, by the time she renewed them in 1979. Sister Margaret Ellen Traxler recalled spending the first 17 years of her life in a formal classroom. Like most U.S. Catholic sisters between the mid-19th and the mid-20th centuries, Traxler supplied the labor that subsidized the vast system of Catholic education. But after marching on Selma in 1965, Traxler began to run national workshops on racial justice, a ministry she found to be more aligned with the apostolic dreams of her order's founder in 19th century Bavaria. Sister Caridad Inda traded her Iowa classroom for doctoral studies in Latin American politics, and after translating into English the documents of the 1968 Medellin Conference and Gustavo Gutierrez's 1973 Theology of Liberation, she committed herself to dismantling hierarchies within the Church and among nations. Sister Rita Mary Bradley, teaching a course in women's studies, coalesced with the directives of Vatican II to convince her to shed the ill-fitting clothing that a male-centered church had designed for women. She was referring not to literal apparel, but to the theology, in her words, of spiritual motherhood that left Catholic sisters entrapped in the cultural baggage of inferiority for centuries. Sister of Loretto Mary Lou Tobin's memoir centered on her experience as one of 15 women auditors at Vatican II. Though women were not allowed to speak at the council proceedings, Tobin talked about how they were given some voice on the commissions dealing with the church in the modern world and the laity. Tobin leaped at the chance to speak at those meetings, feeling that, as she said, it was important for women, at least in setting a precedent for the future. Tobin's insistence on being part of the conversation did set a precedent for countless other sisters. To cite only one example, Sister Bette Moslander, a graduate of the Sacred School of Theology at St. Mary's, became the official LCWR liaison to the Quinn Commission. In that capacity, Moslander led national conversations on the theology and purpose of women's religious life, turning what had started out as a punitive measure into a productive and meaningful one. She called it a highlight of her life. When she delivered the final report of the Quinn Commission, she became the first woman to address the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Sister Bette was a member of the same community as Sister Evangeline Thomas. After her guide was published, Sister Evangeline helped hundreds of other sisters narrate their personal stories by training congregations in the best practices of oral history, a tool utilized by academic historians since the 1940s, but one that became very widespread in the 1960s, propelled by the new social history and advances in recording equipment. The transcripts and audio tapes generated by these projects are, like Sisters' published memoirs, and I've only been able to give a small sampling of them, but they're wonderful. These are invaluable primary sources for historians. But what is evident when reading these oral histories is that the primary audience was not, in fact, future scholars, but the narrators themselves. They were making history by making sense of it in their own lives. In 2022, Pope Francis captured this dynamic beautifully in his Catechesis on Discernment, observing that knowing one's own life story is the key to personal and spiritual insight. Reviewing the events of our lives reveal important nuances, he said, and recounting our stories to others is a sacred act. Following his own advice, Pope Francis recently published this book. In English, it's titled Life, My Story Through History. But in the original Italian, as I have up here, La mia storia nella storia. I see my first Italian teacher in the audience tonight, so I had to do that. I hope I did that. I pronounced that okay. I have read and listened to many oral histories of Catholic sisters from this period, but I am now going to single out one that has recently captured a great deal of my attention. It resulted from one of several large-scale oral history projects sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph between 1977 and the mid-1990s. This particular one was recorded on December 6, 1992. The interviewer was Sister Rosenda Gill, CSJ, and the subject was Sister Catherine Mulcairn, a sister of St. Joseph of Boston who entered the community in 1954 at the age of 18. One reason I'm sharing it is that in details and in tone, it captures the exuberance expressed in other sisters' narratives about renewal and change in the post-Vatican II period. Mulcairn had first met the CSJs when they taught her in high school, and she was attracted to them initially because they seemed to her to be very smart ladies. The first decade of religious life was difficult for Sister Mary Martine, as she was then called. When her beautiful auburn hair was shaved in the novitiate, she reacted viscerally, calling to mind the punishment meted out to French women who had collaborated with Nazi occupiers. The strict injunctions against particular attachments in the convent, designed to foster community and to discourage physical contact among members, left Mulcairn feeling lonely and isolated. From 1958 until 1966, she taught mathematics to sixth graders in overcrowded classrooms at St. Teresa's Parish in West Roxbury, attending classes evenings and weekends at the CSJ-run Regis College. After graduation, she was sent to Simmons College to study library science, her superior's choice, not hers. When asked why she couldn't study literature, which she loved, she said she was told, "We need librarians." Through her frustration, Mulcairn recalls having been heartened by a strong conviction that this is going to change, this will change. And when it did, Sister Maria Martine was at its vanguard. Like many Catholic sisters, Mulcairn reverted to her birth name in response to the Council's emphasis on the baptismal call. Sister Catherine welcomed conversations about how Vatican II invited sisters to share religious life more fully with lay people. She spent the years from 1966 to 1969 at the Order's Scholasticate, where sisters lived while they were studying, recalling it as a good moment, a very lively time where prominent theologians like Bernard Herring delivered lectures and sisters debated and discussed their response to the transformations of the Council era. Mulcairn served on the CSJ's leadership team from 1969 until 1984, the final 6 years of that as its president. She managed the significant responsibilities of the large congregation, leading it through a period of cataclysmic change, her words, when membership declined from 1,900 to 1,400 women. She navigated the archdiocesan bureaucracy exceptionally well, and in 1984, Archbishop Bernard Law invited her to join an archdiocesan task force devoted to fostering lay leadership. Mulcairn accepted, taking a step she saw as a path to a more inclusive future for women in the church. Mulcairn is at her most vivacious in the oral history when recalling her time in the master's program in religious studies at Fordham University, where she studied spirituality with Janet Ruffing, RSM. She remembers that experience as one of the happiest of her life, and much like the founding of the Madeleva lecture, it attests to the vitality of Catholic women's spirituality in the mid-1980s. For all the points of intersection between Mulcairn's story and those of her contemporaries, there are singular aspects to her experience, and she, in fact, would be the first to remind me of that. One of the qualities, I think, that made her such a good leader, and she is remembered as an exceptional leader, was her ability to see the uniqueness of each person's story. When prompted, when recording the oral history by Sister Rosenda to explain why so many sisters left the community in a single year, Mulcairn refused to generalize. She had had conversations with all of them, and she said 40 people had shared 40 stories. And so the distinctiveness of Mulcairn's story is the second reason I'm sharing it with you tonight, and the main reason I've spent so much time with it over the last couple of years. This uniqueness derives from another invitation Mulcairn received from Cardinal Law in spring 1992. A lawsuit alleging sexual abuse by a priest of the Diocese of Fall River had prompted dozens of other victims to come forward. The Cardinal offered Mulcairn a position in the Office of Ministerial Personnel, which handled these allegations. Law explained that its director, Reverend John McCormack, could no longer handle the volume on his own. Mulcairn accepted the position in September 1992. The narrator of Mulcairn's story now shifts from her to me. A warning, this next section does contain some disturbing content, and I want to acknowledge the survivors of sexual violence in the audience and promise you what I have promised all the survivors I have met, either in person or in the archive, since I began researching on this topic. I'll listen carefully to your stories and consider what they mean for the story of the Church in America. By the time she recorded her oral history, Mulcairn had been working in the Office of Ministerial Personnel for about 4 months. Commenting on her new assignment, Sister Rosenda described Mulcairn as being on the cutting edge of the Church in America. Though she is modest, it's clear that Mulcairn was indeed aware that she was making history in the colloquial sense of doing something unprecedented or important. As she explained, her job was to listen to survivors' stories and arrange therapy for them, to assist in creating a new archdiocesan policy, to establish a review board comprised of lay people, and ultimately to help survivors move beyond embarrassment, fear, or shame in the search for the truth. So once again, Mulcairn senses massive change on the horizon. Any fears that she had were tempered by the knowledge that the Church had survived an earlier period of upheaval, and in her view, had emerged stronger and better prepared to respond to the outside world. She also had faith in herself, having led her congregation through one period of transformation and having become one of the very smart ladies she had once so admired. Mulcairn approached her job with confidence that she could guide it through another difficult period. Both her private responses in the interview and her public statements about the new policy suggest that she saw herself as a vital partner in solving a problem plaguing the Church. Exhorting the whole Church to walk together, she observed that if we can talk about these institutions, then we can all be about these situations, then we can all become involved in solving them. It's remarkable then to read another account Mulcairn gave of herself almost exactly 10 years after she narrated her story to Sister Rosenda. On December 19th, 2002, her 67th birthday, and 11 months since the Boston Globe Spotlight investigative team published the first of 800 articles on clergy sex abuse in Boston, Mulcairn was deposed at the law offices of Roderick McLeish in Gregory Ford et al. Versus Cardinal Bernard Law. The main plaintiff had been abused by Reverend Paul Shanley between 1983 and 1989, when he was between the ages of 6 and 12. The case against the cardinal rested on his failure to act against Shanley and other abusive priests. Discovery obtained more than 30,000 pages of documents related to more than 140 Boston priests alleged to have sexually abused minors. Mulcairn had met with victims of about half of those. The transcript runs to 571 pages, but I'm going to show a single one as a springboard into this story. On page 94, McLeish asks Mulcairn if she ever heard allegations of women being raped by priests. He prompts her, "Remember Father Thomas Forey? I'm sorry, Father Meffin?" "Yes," she says. McLeish moves on. Only through an examination of Mulcairn's subsequent testimony, press coverage, deposition exhibits, and other archival sources is it possible to reveal the volumes that her simple yes left unsaid, starting with the fact that Robert Meffin was a name she would have been particularly unlikely to forget. Ordained in 1953, Meffin stands out even among a pantheon of priest perpetrators as especially repulsive. Under the guise of spiritual direction, he initiated sexual acts with teenage girls, encouraging them to believe they were making love to Jesus Christ himself. In at least 3 cases, Meffin persuaded his victims to enter religious life where he continued to abuse them. One of Meffin's survivors testified that he told her the metaphor of Christ and his church as bridegroom and bride was meant to be literal. The public learned the details of Meffin's abuse only during Spotlight, but Boston bishops were made aware of some of them in 1980 and again in 1986, when a former Sister of St. Joseph accused him of abuse before and throughout her years in religious life. She was interviewed by an auxiliary bishop in Boston who informed Meffin of the allegations, which he denied. There, the matter rested until January 1993, when another former CSJ called the office after she had seen Meffin appear on a television show. This time, Catherine Mulcairn was the one to take the phone call. Distraught and sickened, JM told Mulcairn that she knew of 3 CSJs who had been abused by Meffin during her own time in the community 25 years earlier. We can only imagine what went through Mulcairn's mind during that phone call, but because she was a conscientious note-taker, it's possible to verify what she did next, which was follow her standard operating procedure. After searching a locked file drawer that contained records of previous accusations, she learned of the one made against Meffin 7 years earlier. As was her practice, she reached out to his accuser. Though that woman's name has been redacted from the legal files, it's easily discovered through other sources, and thus possible to confirm that this woman had entered the CSJs in 1965 and withdrew in 1976. While it's unclear how well Mulcairn would have known either this woman or the other 2 CSJs known to have been among Meffin's victims, it's hardly conjecture to posit that she found the revelations about her sisters especially heart-wrenching. In the passage from the Ford deposition that follows the first Meffin reference, McLeish read aloud from a memo from Mulcairn to McCormick dated May 18th, 1994. It's in the deposition here, but here it is in the actual memo. CEM, Catherine Elizabeth Mulcairn. "This may be by the books, but it feels like a second victimization. The burden is put on a minor all over again and now on his family. Broken record by CEM. It has come to our attention that a priest stationed here between 19 blank and 19 blank may have molested children. Please contact ... parish bulletin." This referred to another protocol Mulcairn developed after meeting with a victim. She reviewed the abuser's assignment card primarily to check if he was still serving in active ministry. But believing that this information might be used to help more people, Mulcairn suggested that upon hearing credible allegations against a priest, the archdiocese should publish notice in the weekly bulletins of all the parishes in which he had ever served, inviting any person with relevant information to come forward. This would encourage those, she said, who had kept their secrets for years to come forward so that they might be freed. Mulcairn's recommendations were for the most part ignored. Pressed to elaborate on her word choice in this memo, she responded, "I wrote broken record. Any woman saying anything 2 or 3 times or whatever times is a broken record." Gender circumscribed Mulcairn in other ways. Her position, which cardinal law initially presented into her as originating in a need for a division of labor, precipitated by case overload, functioned instead as a differentiation of labor. Mulcairn would meet with the victims and report to McCormick, who would in turn communicate with the accused priests. Mulcairn intuited that McCormick seemed, so many Irish people, wow, that Father McCormick seemed to have more of a feel for priests than victims, and there is ample evidence to confirm that hunch. Consider, for example, the note McCormack sent to Meffin 6 weeks after JM's phone call. I realize that it is not easy to have such allegations made about you, Bob. I sense they are very upsetting. There's evidence of clerical cronyism throughout this deposition and many others. McCormack also muzzled McCarran on the review board. She attended every meeting, but as she testified, she was not on it with voice. McCormack neither consulted her in advance nor allowed her to present. Astonishing, really, given that she had a much fuller picture than any board members who didn't even know the names of the accused, let alone their previous allegations. And while McCormack never met with victims, Mulcairn met with over 200 of them during her time in the Chancery. Mulcairn took meticulous notes during these meetings, recording details of sexual violence unflinchingly. She was a compassionate and active listener. In her follow-up correspondence, she routinely thanked survivors for their courage and their honesty. In turn, they often expressed their gratitude to her. One remembered that the most difficult part of the process was giving the graphic details of what happened, and he found it easier to disclose those details to a woman, a non-male authority figure. Mulcairn's efforts even impressed the head prosecutor, McLeish. "Let's talk about what you tried to do here," he said at one point, which was a lot. But the prosecutors also pressed Mulcairn on what she had not done. She never verified that the psychologist on the review board had expertise in abuse. He did not. She never communicated to anyone but McCormack the scope and magnitude of the abuse. She never ascertained that law knew what she knew. She never went to the police or the papers. In less than 2 years, she lost faith that she could make a difference. She submitted her resignation to Cardinal Law, telling him she was no longer spiritually, psychologically, or physically capable of doing the work. She is more forthright 8 years after the fact. In the 4 depositions, she characterizes herself as traumatized and describes her experience as a nightmare. Standing here today, we might wish that Mulcairn had been, well, less well-behaved, more inclined to make her voice heard, more insistent that the church prioritize its most vulnerable members over its reputation. And yet she remains an extraordinarily sympathetic figure. It is poignant and provocative to reread Mulcairn's oral history under Spotlight's glare. Surely her fond memories of teaching math at St. Teresa's were troubled by learning that 3 students, including one of her own, had been abused by 2 parish priests during her time there. Did it torture her to realize that while she was engaging prominent theologians at the CSJ Scholasticate, exhilarated and inspired by Vatican II, the novices living just across the road were being sexually violated by Robert Meffin? Would she still have viewed her service on the Archdiocesan Task Force as a sign that the church would elevate women's leadership once she left a position in which she had been an authority figure in name only, with little influence and no power? Would she still have believed that openness inevitably led to progress? If Mulcairn's first 40 years in the community tell one story about the leadership of Catholic sisters, her 2 years in the Office of Ministerial Personnel tell a different story. Over time, historians will reconcile these competing narratives. Meanwhile, historians are increasingly adopting clerical sex abuse as a subject of scholarly inquiry, having lagged behind theologians, psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, and legal theorists in this respect. Larger patterns are becoming clear, and Mulcairn's story illuminates one of them. She understood her departure from the Chancery as a failure, one she accepted as uniquely her own. In this, she was replicating the practice of many apologists for the Catholic Church who, in seeking to explain clerical sex abuse, privilege personalities over patterns and blame human weakness instead of structural defects. A historical analysis, by contrast, shifts a great deal of the culpability to the interlocking hierarchies embedded in the Catholic Church, which compromise the ability of women, even courageous, intelligent, and experienced ones, to make much of a difference in mitigating the scourge of clerical sex abuse. And yet, Mulcairn certainly made a difference to the survivors she met, and I could show many more letters like this. For our purposes, Mulcairn definitely made a difference to historians. She had a fascinating relationship with archives. As president of the CSJs, the archives were her responsibility, and in her oral history, she spoke about what archives revealed and what they concealed. In the Chancery, she consulted archival sources regularly, including those in that locked file cabinet. And in relentlessly recording the details of horrific abuse, she created documents that embedded them in the historical record. Remember what Monsignor John Tracy Ellis said: no documents, no history. Without her efforts, this story would be much harder to tell. Mulcairn may have failed to make one kind of history between 1992 and 1994, but over the long run, in God's time maybe, she's making another kind of history possible. And so I am grateful to Mulcairn, as I am to the lawyers who subpoenaed the documents, the journalists who wrote about them, the archivists who are preserving them and making them broadly accessible. Historians may arrive late to this conversation, but once we get our hands on documents, we are tenacious. And like Sister Rosalita Kelly, we're determined to unravel the history, even if others might prefer that it stay unraveled. If I were to tell my life story through history, it would begin with the post-Vatican II churn within the IHMs of Philadelphia, the community my mother joined in 1963 and left in 1967. I would write about how, when I entered high school 40 years ago this year, I found my own very smart ladies among the Sisters of Mercy and Sisters of St. Joseph. Little did I know that Evangeline Thomas and Elizabeth Culmer and Mary Evans were at that moment creating a subfield in which I would find a happy scholarly home. To my great delight and surprise, Mary Evans is here tonight, and I would just love to give her a round of applause. Where is she? Yeah. Mary is here with Janet Welsh, who is my intellectual sister. She and I both worked with Jay Dolan, and again, I did not know that they were going to be here, and I'm just so glad they're here. I've been so lucky to meet sisters like them and many others. I remember in the mid-1990s when I was starting to think about a dissertation topic, I remember telling Jay Dolan very saucily, as only a second-year doctoral student can do, I said, you didn't write enough about women. He shrugged and said, you're right, I didn't, but you can, and I have. And I've met the most amazing colleagues along the way, many through the Conference on the History of Women Religious, which has convened every 3 years since that first gathering in the 1980s, and affiliated with the Cushwa Center since 2013. The program for the upcoming June meeting, which is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Spirituality, reflects the increasingly global orientation of the conference. It also shows a sharp acceleration of a trend that shaped it from the beginning, a steady decrease in Catholic sisters' participation. On a program of 113 people, only 12 are members of women's religious communities. Looking at some of the recent books that feature U.S. Catholic sisters as their protagonists, we see that none of the authors are sisters. Less obvious, but even more telling, is that none of these authors worked with Catholic sisters in graduate school. While many sisters pursued the academic study of theology, very few became historians. Those who did became excellent scholars. But for the most part, they did not teach at PhD granting research institutions. No sister ever succeeded John Tracy Ellis. Neither have there been historian equivalents of Sisters Sandra Schneiders, Elizabeth Johnson, Margaret Farley, Catherine Hilkert, Marianne Hinsdale, or the other Madeleva lecturers who trained generations of graduate students. This is more of an observation than a lament. We can marvel, in fact, that sisters' stories have merged with broader historiographies to an extent far beyond the imaginations of the first sister historians. These are books that deal with race, the history of American foreign policy, the history of social services, colonial France. So as I said, it's not necessarily a lament. What is clear is that going forward, the history of women religious will be mostly written by scholars who are not themselves members of religious communities. This is not to say that sisters are not continuing to shape their stories, and in fact, they are actively doing so through creative partnerships with archivists, historians, universities, and philanthropists. We can see evidence of one such collaboration right here on the Avenue, where a 12,000 square foot archival repository will open next fall. Spearheaded by the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Heritage and Archives Research Center will hold documents and artifacts from at least 9 different women's communities, centering on the women whose vision, values, courage, and imagination contributed to shaping the modern world and the church. HARC has one eye on preserving the past and another on the future, hoping to inspire future generations by highlighting Catholic sisters' impact on education, healthcare, and social justice. With the Cushwa Center and Notre Dame Archives, the tri-campus community will become an important hub for the study of Catholic sisters. I hope it provides many more opportunities for all of us to cross the road, something we don't do often enough. HARC is part of a consortium that includes new collaborative repositories at Boston College, at Santa Clara University, and the Women's Collaborative Religious Archive in Cleveland. All are committed to preserving collections that might otherwise be lost and to making the material accessible to researchers. With the records of multiple communities housed in one place, it has never been easier for scholars to discern the patterns that are going to frame the new stories for this new moment. We are witnessing another aggiornamento in the archives. As historians ask sisters to trust us to tell their stories, we ask ourselves a question that I invite all of you to consider. You can answer this question whether you yourself are a member of a women's religious community or if you've never even met a Catholic sister in person. You can answer it whether you are a theologian or a sociologist or a poet. You can answer it whether you're a faculty or staff member, a student or administrator at St. Mary's, or if you've been educated or employed by any number of the institutions in this country founded and animated by Catholic sisters. You can answer this question if you worry about the future of education, healthcare, or social services in this country, or if you care that the Catholic Church will continue to be a vital force in the US and in the world. You can answer this question if you're trying to find your voice in an institution that would prefer that you keep silent. You can answer this question if you're a person trying to become the author of your own story, over and against the objections of those who would tell it another way. You can answer it if you believe that shining on light on what has been hidden, even in history's darkest corners, offers one path to redemption. You can answer it if you believe that an honest appraisal of the ways an institution has fallen short represents not a rejection of that institution, but a way to love it better and more deeply. So here's the question. As you reflect on the imagination, witness, and leadership of American Catholic sisters, what will you make of the history that they made? Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cummings. We have about 7 to 10 minutes to take some questions from our live studio audience, as they say. So my colleagues have microphones in the aisles. If you'd like to ask a question of Professor Cummings, please raise your hand and they'll find you.
Oh.
Thanks. Hello. Yes. Thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. So rich in detail. And I work on sisters, but in the medieval period. So if
That's
this,
okay. We like
if
you
this
too.
is, yeah. And I see a lot of continuities. So that's very interesting. But because I'm a historian, I'm also obsessed with documents. We love documents.
We love them so much.
So much. And we love for them to be accessible to us. And so I have I have two document-related questions. One is more specifically about the in-house chronicles that you mentioned at the
Mhm.
beginning of your talk, which is also, we see this in medieval women's communities too. And I'm just kind of curious about what's the general kind of form of them? Do they maybe include like biographies of some of the sisters, or if you could say a bit more about that? And then the second document related question, if I may, is more about like accessibility, about how accessible have these sources been to you, to, you know, maybe independent researchers too. This Heritage and Research Center is going to be amazing. But I imagine that there are also some kind of maybe limitations and challenges and stuff. So I'm just curious about, yeah, how aggiornamento the archives have been. And
Well, first of all, I didn't want to entirely diss those in-house chronicles. They are an amazing help to us as we get, they're so rich with information and detail. They have names, they have dates, they have, they're not that exciting to read, but they're a great starting place. And as I say, they leave out all the good parts most of the time. The trouble was visited upon the congregation. So they're really important, and I spend a lot of time with them. As for, yeah, I mean, it's uneven, right? I mean, it's just, I remember, it can be very hard still to get into certain archives. And I remember one time, one of my first archival experiences, I was at the Sisters of St. Joseph in Philadelphia, doing some research, and there was a sister there who wound up being great. The story ends well, but she was just really suspicious of what I was trying to do. I mean, I was trying to talk about sisters' education in the 1880s. So, you know, and she just, I could tell by her body language, you know, she was very upset. And I said, "Sister, is there a problem?" She said, "You're asking for files that have sisters' grades in them." And I said, I promise I'm not going to, you know, record that sister so-and-so got a B in 1887 in her, you know. So a lot of it is communication. I always tell anybody it requires a first visit and kind of, you know, but I think it's as sisters are, as many communities are doing collaborative archives or hiring trained archivists, it's getting, it's getting much easier. So, yeah. But I could talk all day about experiences in archives. Thank you.
Not related. I just wonder if there's other Madeleva lectures, former lectures here in the room.
Yes, there's one sitting right behind you.
Are there other?
Yeah.
I used to.
And yeah, there's two right there, and yeah, three. No.
Bend down. Oh, no. Sorry.
I'm supposed to wait till tomorrow, but I need to think, and I want a data point from you first.
Okay.
Sister I'm sorry.
Catherine Mulcairn.
Yeah, Catherine Mulcairn. She was appointed in 1992 to this
Correct.
position, 10 years before Spotlight.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And she left in 1994. So, but her fingerprints are all over the story later made public by Spotlight. Yeah. So her deposition happened after Spotlight.
As you were talking, I was very aware that you were speaking about religious communities whose primary apostolate work had shifted during, say, 70 years, just prior to Vatican Council II, and then, of course, afterwards. And part of that shift was away from education in elementary schools, high schools, and many colleges, both for women and also for men, were closed. And I'm wondering if you have studied a religious community such as the Religious of the Sacred Heart, who have really stayed with that education ministry, although they have some offshoots into, usually as part of the work of their schools, in social work and such areas. Have you studied such a community as
I have
that?
not personally studied the RSCJ. Or not in this for this topic. I've looked at them a great deal in terms of the canonization of Philippine Duchenne. Many of my colleagues have, and yes, and not all sisters left. Oh, I can see you now. Sorry, the light was in my eye, Sister Eva. I couldn't. I just heard your voice. I recognized your voice right away, but I didn't actually see you. So yes, and I would just channel Sister Catherine, who says, the 40 women who left had 40 different stories. Each religious community, there are patterns, but there are different stories among them. So yeah, I mean, all the communities made different decisions, but I haven't particularly, but I have colleagues who are writing the history of the Religious of the Sacred Heart.
You mentioned that you're the first historian to give Madeleva lecture and hopefully not the last.
I don't know. I don't know.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we can collaborate across disciplines. I mean, I'm in theology. I saw a lot of resonances in terms of telling stories, making history, but especially in doctoral studies, you can become so specialized. And even though interdisciplinary is a buzzword, it's hard to actually have real mentors or colleagues in other areas because there's just, limited time and you have requirements. So what are ways in which historians and sociologists and theologians, how can we all collaborate to tell women's stories and make history?
Absolutely. We're all so siloed and we all have so much to do within our own institutions and disciplines. I think places that have convening power, like the Center for the Study of Spirituality. I mean, this is the Kushwa Center at Notre Dame, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. There are places like that, and I think they're going to be ever more important. I do think the possibility of virtual connections has helped a lot. I think it can be. I remember the first time I did present at the College Theology Society once when I was a doctoral student, and gosh, I was so nervous, and but it made me think. And one of my departments is American Studies, which is we're all interdisciplinary, and I know how energizing it is, but it does take you out of your comfort zone a bit, and I think it's just about finding those opportunities. But I think the centers like this one are invaluable in terms of their convening power. So thank you, Dan, for, and I know what you're doing to convene people here is really marvelous. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cummings. I was going to say join me in applauding, but you beat me to it. So thank you very much again for this extraordinary lecture. So much to process, so many stories to reflect upon, and so many connections, interdisciplinary and otherwise, to be made. Before we go, there's just a few business items and some exciting announcements. The first of which is going to be that this conversation is not over. We want to invite you to join us, those of you here in person, in the atrium outside the auditorium for a dessert and coffee reception where you can continue this discussion with Professor Cummings and with one another. Second, we're delighted that our campus bookstore has some of Dr. Cummings's books available for sale, as well as, I believe in the lecture, it was announced as forthcoming volume that was edited by my colleague Jessica Koblenz and I, titled Women Responding to the Spirit, Selections from the Madeleva Lectures, but it is in print and for sale outside. So check that out for sure. And we have some of those contributors, those previous Madeleva lectures. And since it was asked, I'll just state for the record, we have Dr. Gail Mandel, Dr. Kathy Hilkert, and Dr. Susan Ross, who are with us previous Madeleva lectures. So to acknowledge you, thank you for. As a theologian, I realize that math is not my strong suit. We have 4 previous Madeleva lecturers in the room, Dr. Kathy Cummings, too. The third of, I promise, 4 very short announcements is really quite exciting. And I want to just take a moment to highlight a brand new program that its primary purpose is, as Dr. Cummings said, the convening of scholars and to a certain degree, interdisciplinary scholars. And we're proud at the center to announce our first Madeleva Fellowship cohort. The Madeleva Fellowship program was established here at the Center for the Study of Spirituality this year. It's designed to support women doctoral candidates in the areas of theology, spirituality, and other specializations in the field of religious studies. Madeleva Fellows receive travel and housing funding to come here on campus at St. Mary's to participate in events and workshops connected with this annual Madeleva lecture, including opportunities to engage with the lecturer herself, and that will continue tomorrow morning in a seminar, which we're really excited about. Additionally, Madeleva Fellows receive mentoring and teaching and writing and cohort gatherings throughout the spring semester. This year's amazing group of 10 women doctoral candidates join us from universities across the United States, including the University of Virginia, Marquette University, Boston College, the University of Dayton, Fuller Theological Seminary, and Villanova University. University of Notre Dame is welcome to apply as well, just saying. It's such a long commute across 933. Tell your colleagues, tell your colleagues. I do want to acknowledge the generosity. This program was made possible by a gift from a St. Mary's College alumna of the class of 1951. And so I want to thank Mary Alice. Yes. I want to thank Mary Alice Stanton and her husband Vincent, who live stream many of our programs and may be watching us now, and we thank you. Can I ask the 10 Madeleva Fellows who are with us to please stand to be recognized? Thank you very much. And finally, it's my pleasure, as we do at the end of every Madeleva lecture, to announce the 2026 Madeleva lecturer. Yes, drum roll, please. The 2026 Madeleva lecture will be delivered by Professor Tracy Sayuki Tiermeyer, who is Professor of Theological Studies and Chair of the Department of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. She is a renowned Catholic scholar of comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, Asian and Asian American theology, and Hindu Christian studies. She is focused on gender, race, and liberation within those contexts, so we're building on that interdisciplinarity for sure. Next year's Madeleva lecture will take place here on Thursday, April 9th, 2026. We hope to see you next year, so please save the date. And in the meantime, join us for some cupcakes and other dessert in the lobby, and have a wonderful, I'm being reminded by my colleague, if I can have the Madeleva Fellows stay behind so we can do a group picture up here on stage. Everybody else to the desserts. Thank you and have a lovely evening.